Tonight, our librarian Janice Loo will share with us a research article entitled Women and Cookbooks in British Malaya. And in this article, she explores cookbooks, household advice, and other materials from the National Library's collection that shed light on women's lives and domesticity. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Janice Loo.
So the cookbook kind of emerged out of the larger process by which knowledge that had for a long time been passed down from generations to generations in an oral form came to be captured and disseminated in print. So they are fascinating because in the broader sense, they tell us about how people lived, their culture, their perceptions and attitudes. So I'm interested in women's history, and since I work in a library, I like to look at where the voices and the knowledge of women have been permanently recorded in print. So I'm interested in the ideas that women want to communicate through the cookbooks they wrote. But my focus is not really on the recipes or the food, even though I would like touch on them. Cookbooks are typically written by women for women, and they provided a means for women to educate and prepare themselves for their role, which is basically they're mainly homemakers at that time, right? And they express in a material form the idea that femininity, which is what it means to be a woman, and domesticity, home and family life, they go hand in hand. So the production and circulation of cookbooks contributed to fashioning and propagating the feminine ideal of a housewife, right? So although the content of cookbooks themselves, they seem to focus on things that happen in the kitchen, happen at home, the cookbook was a platform for women to express an opinion, a public opinion to a community of readers about wider social matters, and even to contribute in a very tangible way to these matters, as we shall see in the next hour. So these are the cookbooks that I will be covering, and they are from our rare material collections, and our reference closed text collection. So in terms of the time period, they were published in the first half of the 20th century, so it's between early 1900s to the 1950s or 60s. So the focus, you will notice, is actually on English language cookery books, because we are looking at women who were not only literate, but they had the resources and the networks to put together and publish a book. So, but even as I'm talking about cookbooks, right, I'll also be referring to other materials like newspapers and household manuals. So, okay, I will start with the Mam's Own Cookery book, which is actually one of the highlights of the print cookbooks in our rare materials collection. So Mam's Own was actually first published in 1920. It sold out in a few months and was so popular that a second edition was put out in 1922, and then a third edition in 1929. So we don't have the first or the second, but we have the third. And we have had this third edition with us for a very long time, as you can tell by the Raffles Library stamp here. And this date, September 24th, 1932, is actually the date when this book actually went into circulation. And then you also see in between the pages of this book, right, there would be this stamp, Raffles Library Singapore Straits Settlements. And the book is actually on display here. So you can actually come up and look at it later. So the author is Mrs. W.E. Kinsey. Where's her name? Mrs. W.E. Kinsey. So unfortunately, not much is known about her, except that her husband was an inspector of mines and later a forestry official in the Federated Malay States. So who were the Mems that she is referring to? So Mems was a term of respect used by non-Europeans to address white married women in Malaya, whereas Tuan was used to, it was honorific meaning sir or Mr., to address a white man. So European women began arriving here in larger numbers from 1910 onwards due to improvements in travel and living conditions in Malaya. So while some were single women, engaged in teaching or in the medical profession or missionary work, the majority of women were actually wives of men in government service and private enterprise. So as homemakers, the Mems played an important role in recreating normal domestic and social life in colonial settings, yes, and the colonial bungalow, like the hotels and the recreation clubs for Europeans, was a refuge or an oasis of white civilization in the inhospitable tropics. So by maintaining the standards of white domestic life, eating and living as though you're back home, it maintained, the European identity. So Mrs. Kinsey's book addressed the Mems, the concerns and anxieties of the Mems who had to deal with the challenge of establishing a home away from home Malaya. So, okay, the text is kind of small, but all the black underlining is by me lah. So, according to the preface, Mrs. Kinsey aimed, and I quote, to help ma'ams who are keen on taking advantage of the possibilities of catering in this country. So she's referring to those who take an interest in the issue of diet, what to eat every day in Malaya, given the fact that they do not have access to the same foodstuffs as they had back home. So the main selling points of Mrs. Kinsey's book are, the sheer number of recipes. She had like 420 recipes, and they are all tried and economical based on 5 years practical application by Mrs. Kinsey in Seremban, Negeri Sembilan, in the Federated Malay States. So when you say like tried and tested, it almost sounds like she did 420 scientific experiments in her kitchen, and then, if she produced this book, that then other women can then replicate like scientific experiments in their own kitchens. So the authoritativeness of Mrs. Kinsey and the reliability of her recipes are emphasized on the cover. Where is it? Yeah, so on the cover it says tried and economical. And it's also repeated again in the preface, tried and proved. And also in the advertisement for Mrs. Kinsey's book, it's like, suitable for Malay and the East, all proved by the author in Seremban. So there's this emphasis on, reliability, and it's been tested and all that, and you can totally just replicate whatever is in it. So, okay. So Mrs. Kinsey thus appealed to aspiring ma'ams with the prospect of efficient domestic management made easier through recipes that can be done by anybody. So cookbooks provided a standard repertoire of recipes suitable for European consumption in the tropics. And these recipes sustained the health of the colonial body and by extension the vitality of the empire. So recipes in this book reflect the hybrid or fusion nature of colonial cuisine. They cover the quintessential British fare, what these are shepherd's pie, pie and pudding and roast. So they covered what they would have at home, as well as French and Anglo-Indian dishes familiar to the British palate, such as Cookery and fish and moli, which were basically, the dishes that the British had in India, and then they brought it back home, and then they incorporated it into their everyday cuisine. So, to combat the monotony of the diet, Mrs. Kinsey would provide variations on the same recipes. So you can see here, ikan kurau number 1, 2, 3, 4. Remains of cold fish number 1, 2, 3. Beef soup 1, 2, 3, 4. So, yeah. So there are a lot of different ways to make the same dish. And she also incorporated local ingredients, as you can see, ikan kurau. Yep. And there are also mentions of cold storage. So this was where you could obtain foodstuffs, imported foodstuffs from Europe. And it was also very economical in terms of reusing leftovers. So all the remains were kept and reused in certain ways. So interestingly, there are also recipes for rendang and satay. So which shows how cookbooks played a role in translating and explaining otherwise exotic dishes for European audience. So you can come forward and see the recipe for rendang later and see whether you want to try and make it yourself. Yeah. So in terms of the format of the recipes, you can see that the information is relayed in a sequential manner. So, but the ingredients and the cooking method are kind of collapsed together. Yeah, in one, followed by the cost, portions, and Mrs. Kinsey's own tips at the end. So they're all like lumped in one paragraph. So you can imagine that with this information, the ma'am could prepare the meals for herself. But more than a means for educating the self, the recipe book was used to instruct the servant, namely the Chinese cook, the cookie. So you can see there he is in the photograph, he's holding his pen. I mean the cooking pen, not the PEN pen. Yeah, so servants were crucial to the well-being and prestige of the colonial elite, and European families, they engaged a minimum of 3 and often more than 6 servants, comprising a sais. So the sais is somebody who grooms the horses. How do I know he's a sais? He's holding this brush here that, I went to check it out. I think it's used for grooming horses. And then he would drive the carriages as well. And then there's a cookie, the boy, houseboy, Dobby, who is the washerman, Kabun, the gardener, he's holding the clippers. And then this guy, he's sitting on a water barrel. So he's the tukang air, the guy who fetches the water. I can't really tell who the rest are, so, but never mind. Okay. So it was the ma'am's job to supervise the servants, plan the menu, and do the budgeting. So the home was like the British Empire on a small scale, with the white mistress governing her multiracial subordinates. So her conduct and her successful administration carried a kind of political significance in reinforcing colonial authority even within the domestic sphere. So, well, this is one representation of reality. So this is another one. So actually, it's very rare to come across depictions of domestic interiors in books at that time. So, I was very excited to actually come across this. So from this one, right, you can see that they're taking a break. The servants are taking a break. This is the houseboy. And then he's kind of like smoking languidly. And you can tell that the air is barely moving because his smoke is just wafting upwards. And then you can see from the shadows, right, it's probably like midday because it's like very long. This is the cook. He's like, his back is turned toward us and he's holding a pail. I'm not sure whether he's working or he's relaxing. Never mind. So this is Ama. So Ama is, if the family had a child, they would engage the nanny to look after the child. And over here, she's kind of like she looks like a very formidable figure, doesn't she? Has this like, and this is the tukang air. So I kind of feel that their expressions, there's a very dignified kind of expression on their faces. So to give you a better sense of what a character the cook was and what the man was up against in trying to manage him, so here's my favorite quote. So I'm going to read this out. Most households in Malaya are the proud possessors of one of those household treasures, the Chinese cookie. He reigns supreme in the back premises and makes or mars our existence. Customs of the country are hard to break, but why the average European in this country should tolerate the usual meal as served by a Chinese cookie is past understanding. Because we go on doing so, they must either believe we like it or that we do not know any better, both of which ideas are hardly flattering to our mentality. If left to his own devices, the average Chinese cook will serve up the same kind of meals day in, day out for all time. In a bachelor mess where the occupants cannot spare the time to deal with cookie, this is unavoidable. But where there is a woman in the house, it is little short of a disgrace. How well some of us must know the typical Chinese cook's dinner: hot water soup with bits of green stuff floating in it, plain fried or boiled fish, sliced up meat, potatoes, and the everlasting beans, pudding, or tinned fruit with custard. It is a peculiar delusion of the race that they imagine all Europeans take custard with every kind of sweet. And then this is the punchline where she basically, this person who wrote in the newspaper, she said, "It is up to the women in Malaya to break down these awful customs of the country. If we only take the trouble to try and teach Cookie something of Western ideas and Western methods, we shall not find him too unintelligent." So this kind of disparaging comments, you will find it very often in the newspapers. But when I read these things, it's also very funny because it shows you how the British in Malaya, when they meet with difficult situations, they always have this dry humor. Yeah, so it's quite funny. So anyway, this last line, well, it kind of highlights the civilizing mission of the ma'am. So, as I said, right, the cookbook was a tool to help the ma'am run the household, particularly in managing the cook. Because the reality was that most ma'ams, they didn't do the marketing themselves because the wet markets weren't especially nice places, and not to mention her limited language skills and lack of knowledge regarding local produce. So the cook would do the daily marketing and in the process pocket some of the money. So, as I mentioned earlier, right, most of the recipes in ma'am's own will state the cost of the ingredients, the portions, and the number of servings. And by placing this information at the ma'am's disposal, Mrs. Kinsey hoped that her book, I quote again from the preface, would assist to combat the pernicious policy of the native cooks who not only overcharge in the prices of local commodities, but generally will not produce them or attempt to raise the non-existent difficulties. So basically, theoretically, with the book in hand, right, the ma'am could simply construct a roster of courses, of dishes, and instruct the cook to prepare it with the certainty that it can be done because it's tried and tested, right? And if the cook tries and I don't know, at least she knows roughly how much it costs based on the cookbook, right? So this book review, this book review here. Again, it says, it is a useful book for local housekeepers who believe in having a say in their own households and do not trust theirs and tuan's digestion to the tender mercies of the cookie. So, in the newspapers, there's a lot of this kind of things, a lot of complaints, a lot of about how the cooks are rude, dishonest, everything. So, and it also suggests that useful hints on cooking from Mrs. Kinsey's book might well be translated into Chinese for the benefit of the autocrat of the kitchen. So the ma'am is not the, even though she's technically the employer, it looks like the cook has the upper hand. So, yeah. So you see that there's a lot of this. Okay. So these are some of her hints on cooking, which again expresses those very disparaging ideas about towards their Chinese cooks. So it says the native cook's idea of roasting joints is to sprinkle over freely Chinese sauce and salt. And naturally, the sauce drains the juice out, the very thing that should be kept in. Even if you give him good dripping for the joint, if he's not watched, he will still do the same and steal part of the dripping too. So it's like, they just steal everything. Yeah. And then it says, the secret of good roasting is continual basting, a fact the native cooks can't grasp or won't. So again, her book was like phenomenally successful, and she released a sequel in 1927 called The Next Meal Cookery Book. So Next Meal basically continues the same ideas that we have examined earlier in Mem's Own, and but the thing I want to highlight is that Mrs. Kinsey's specialty was actually her jams and pickles and preserves, which actually won a silver medal at the Malaya Borneo exhibition in 1922. So her recipes for jams, preserves, pickles actually feature more prominently in this book, and you can also come in front and see later. I flipped the book to that particular page. So for her jams, right, she incorporates a lot of local ingredients. So there are jams made out of rambutan, mangosteen, soursop, and jambu, and then as well as pickles and chutneys out of local ingredients such as belimbing, coconut shoot, lady's fingers, brinjal, and mango. So ostensibly about cookery, the Next Meal Cookery book also includes a section on household tips on cleaning carpets, removing stains, how to get rid of cockroaches and ants, how to deal with burns and rashes, how to take care of your books in the tropics, which, by putting it in a print form, it kind of reveals the hidden labor behind keeping home in the tropics, right? So in addition, she also includes 2 weeks' worth of menus to feed 2 persons, as well as menus for tiffin and dinner parties to host 8 persons, which also points to the entertaining that a lot of European families did at home. Mrs. Kinsey and her publisher were quite enterprising, so these 2 books were actually released in a 2-volume set. And the thing is, the Next Meal Cookery book would reference her first book. So it's like, you cannot buy this without buying this, right? Yeah, so also cookbooks, both of the cookbooks, Mem's Own and Next Meal, featured advertisements quite prominently. But where Mem's Own, I think, had only about, I counted about 10 pages of advertisements, including the one on the front and back covers. In Next Meal, I think there were about over 20 sort of pages of advertisements, which kind of demonstrates that she was really very successful, right? And then so I just highlight these 2, which she super endorses. So it says, Bear Brand tinned milk, right? She says in the preface, for all purposes where tinned milk is used, I have found that no milk has given such good results as Bear Brand milk. And then the Bear Brand, this is actually on the back cover of the Next Meal, and it says, this milk has been used in the making of the recipes contained in this publication and has been found to give the best results. Yeah. And then also in her own recipes itself, sometimes she also names certain brands of things. So one is actually Nelson's gelatin. So which in her recipes for puddings or anything that requires gelatin, she would actually explicitly say Nelson's gelatin. So yeah, and it says Nelson's gelatin is recommended throughout the Next Meal cookbook. Yeah, so she was something of like a social influencer of her time. Yeah. Okay, so if you remember just now I mentioned, one of the book reviews actually suggested that why not, you translate some of these cooking hints into Chinese for the benefit of the Chinese cook, right? So actually, we have a bilingual cookery book in English and Chinese, and it's titled Some Simple Dishes in English and Chinese. Okay, it's quite obvious. And it's actually the earliest cookbook in our collection. This was published in 1916. So according to the preface, which is very difficult for you to read. So it says, this small collection of recipes was originally made and translated for the use of the writer's Chinese cook. And it is in the hope that it may be useful to others that it is now published. So you can see that the cookbook enabled individual women to then share their knowledge and experience with a wider community beyond what, like traditionally your own family. So at 40 pages, this cookbook is actually a very, very slim volume compared to Mrs. Kinsey's Mem's Own, because Mem's Own was 160 pages. So this is very slim. And it's difficult to discover more about this writer because she's not named. She's only signed off as British North Borneo. So, however, as you can see, she shares the same desire to help other Mems. So the writer also says that this book does not claim to be in any way comprehensive, but merely aims at economy and simplicity, and is intended chiefly for use in outstations where a variety of supplies is not easily come by. So it's meant to help MEMS, especially in the more remote, the more ulu places of the empire, and there are no advertisements inside here. So this book has a good many recipes for chicken, eggs, potatoes, and simple puddings. So there are 13 recipes for chicken, 6 for potatoes, and 27 ways of cooking fish. So, but however, right, the 27 ways of cooking fish is just given in a listing. So perhaps assuming that the reader should already know how to prepare the fishes in the 27 ways. So maybe it's like common knowledge, like how to boil an egg, which you don't need a recipe for, I assume. So there's no content page for this, and if you flip through the pages, there's also no apparent systematic way of organizing the recipes, either by types or alphabetical order or anything. But generally, the recipes for puddings cluster in the middle. There are a few pages on sauces, and then followed by cake recipes. And below here is, you see the Chinese translation of the preface, which is read top to bottom and then left to right. And then you can see that there are no punctuations, which is very difficult, which makes it a challenge to read, actually. But I also read that European-style punctuation marks were introduced in the early 20th century, and maybe it hasn't become the standard yet over here. So I can't really ascertain the quality of the translation, as the grammar is quite different from today. But I think the information given here is more or less what is given in the English one. But the other thing I wonder is, does this translation is it more catered towards a particular dialect group? Like, maybe it could be the Cantonese or something. So, the Cookery book is up here. So if any of you all have an interest in this, you can come and take a look. So, but of course, the fact that they translated into Chinese assumes that the cooks are literate, which I don't really think that, I don't know. So, okay. So, this is an example of the recipes, and if you can read Mandarin, right, I mean Chinese, right? Can you tell me what's wrong? Can you tell me what's wrong with this particular page? Anybody? Yeah, correct. This is clear tomato soup, right? But this recipe is actually egg balls for soup. And this is tomato soup down here. So, I mean, if you imagine, right, like if you were the ma'am and you are trying to communicate with your cook, you see, you're like, ma'am wants clear tomato soup, then you go and cook egg balls for soup. So, yeah, so actually in this recipe book, they are quite, I mean, this is, I think, the only sort of major boo-boo that I came across, So, yeah, still forgivable, so long as the ma'am doesn't order this dish. So, okay, so here's the cookery again, and then, for this one, right, I found it quite interesting because the Chinese translation is a transliteration. It doesn't translate the concept of the dish at all. Like, for example, apricot fritters is transliterated as Ya Bu Li Ge Fu Li Da. So, again, you could try and imagine how would they have communicated with each other. I mean, the man would be like, I want apricot fritters. Would the cook think, it's Ya Bu Li Ge Fu Li Da? It's like, I don't know. Yeah, but this is quite interesting to me because, to me, it's something like a fritter kind of thing. Is like in Chinese, you'll be like cha, something, right? So you can see that, in translation, they, take reference from the English name for the dish. Okay, so much for bilingual translations. Okay, so here's another resource for the MEM. So apart from cookbooks, right, there was also Malay phrase books. So this is the only title that I've come across that specifically focuses on teaching the mem kitchen Malay. So you can see this is written by the author herself. So she says, the object of this little book is to place before newcomers, especially women, the most ordinary and necessary words and phrases required in household management. So if you don't know Malay back then, you cannot command your household, because Malay was the language you would use to communicate with your servants. So this, our earliest copy is, this is the earliest copy that we have, is published in 1929. I guess it was formerly owned by a lady named Margaret Wade, and inside it you would find that there's a stamp of Shonan Toshokan. So Shonan Library, which is when we were under Japanese occupation. So, the words contained in this book, right, the vocabulary and everything, were chosen based on the author's own experience, and from these you can get a sense of the kind of communication between the ma'am and the servants, as well as the kind of chores that needed to be done. So this is actually very popular. It was republished in several editions all the way up to 1958, with very little change to the content. So between 1929 and 1958, very little change to the content. So I have a copy here, a very small book here, 1956, which you can later browse. So, of course, I'm interested in the section on meals. So there are a few pages devoted to meals, how would you order them in Malay, what kind of instructions would you give? For example, it says here, I want to inspect the kitchen today. Ini hari, saya mau perkan dapur. And then you can also see that sometimes they would, someone has actually struck out something and scribbled something. So you see that these books were actually used. These are signs of their previous life. So this is the funniest part. So interestingly, there's also a comment about how Chinese servants speak Malay very badly, owing to their inability to pronounce certain letters. And the letters include L. So roti becomes loti. And then dapur becomes lapor. Yeah. So, and then over here also, you can see that for some of the dishes, right, like meat patty, you have to say minci pap. And then for sausage roll, saucy lo, which is the Chinese pronunciation. So, I mean, it's very cute because, like back then, you wouldn't know how people would have, kind of like spoken, or how they would have pronounced things. But over here, we have some record, yeah. So next, we move on to the Young Women Christian Association Cookbook, so which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So it was first published in 1932, and unfortunately, we don't have the first edition, but we welcome anyone who wishes to donate their first edition to us. So I'll be mainly looking at the 1935 edition, which is actually the second. So the cover design you see here is very typical, you see. It's a very typical scene of Malaya. You must have coconut tree, you must have the sea, and you must have houses on stilts in the background. Then you know it's Malaya, right? So, because not the ma'ams, right, you have servants, you don't really have to cook and clean, and so you are free to undertake charitable and voluntary welfare work through organizations such as the YWCA. So one of the things that they did, and I guess they still do, in terms of promoting the cause of female education, was to organize classes where European women would instruct local women on cooking and other domestic skills like sewing. So such classes became a platform for cultural exchange between women, which demonstrates the shared feminine interests that cut across, ethnic and class lines. So a bit on the background of the book. I've extracted the preface here. So it explains that the idea for this book came up at the YWCA Malayan conference held in Ipoh, 1931. So at the conference, it was suggested that the numerous recipes used in the cooking lessons conducted in the different centers, YWCA centers in Singapore, Ipoh, Kuala Lumpur, so on, be preserved in book form. So this is, then they published the 1932 edition. So of course, it was so popular that the book was reprinted in 1933, and then that printing is sold out, and then 1937, they did another reprint. So, okay, so the proceeds of the book, right, went to support the activities of the association. So the editors of this book were were Mrs. Ursula Holtham, who was wife of the director of the Botanic Gardens, and Mrs. Gertrude Hinch, who was wife of the principal of the Anglo-Chinese school. So both were active in the YWCA, where Mrs. Holtham was the treasurer and Mrs. Hinch was the head of the YWCA in Malaya. So they undertook the remarkable effort of collecting and organizing this 460 over recipes, you see, and then they organized the information and then they published it, so that this knowledge, right, that contained in all their cooking lessons actually assumes a kind of tangible form, and it can be transmitted, it can be studied, and it can be acquired by other people. So unlike the other cookbooks that we were looking at previously, which was based on the experience of a single author, this publication is the result of a collective effort and is testimony to the kind of community networks that women had. So it's a very ambitious project, as I said, because it brought 460 recipes from all over Malaya, and I counted half of the recipes were contributed. I mean, they had the contributors named there. And the preface over here, it acknowledges the help of Chinese and Indian friends in compiling their own sections. So, by putting all these together, it kind of maps the culinary diversity of Malaya. Okay, so these were the names of some of the contributors. It's very varied. There are like people who wrote under pseudonyms. Anak Sungai, 1934. Don't know who. A Chinese cook. Not bad, right? Chinese cook also contribute to Cookbook. Yeah. So A. Dodsworth, Penang. Celeste B. Stutz. And then who else? Even people from the fisheries department. So you can see that there were all these representation of women from different communities that contributed their recipes to the YWCA book. So the YWCA book actually differs quite significantly from MEM's own, as you will note from the sections it has. So you see here it says food values. Okay, there's food values, local market produce, and glossary of local names, and choosing fish. So this part, right, actually introduces you to the kind of methods and principles of cooking, this part. Okay, so basically, before every recipe or every section, like you see here, European section, Chinese section, Indian section, Malay section, before every section, there will be like a general discussion of the principles for that particular section. And that applies to the dishes as well, how to make soup, how to cook meat, how to cook fish, and all that. So, but going back to this earlier section, right, so it introduces the idea of nutrition, where this Professor J.L. Rosedale from, this professor of biochemistry from the medical school in Singapore, basically, this chapter explains how the individual's energy requirements is the basis for healthy eating in the tropics. And attached to this chapter on food values is actually several pages given the chemical kind of breakdown of the Malayan foods, where over 90 local products, including shark's fin and belacan, are reduced to their nutritional components. So more like how much fat, how much protein, how much carbohydrates, how much fiber, how much, these things that your belacan contains. And the number of calories. So if you see, before, right, MEM's own, it didn't have these things, but by like the 1930s, right, there was that concept of nutrition, you see. So it offers comprehensive guidance, like compared to MEM's own, which was only about recipes. It provides comprehensive guidance that extends to meal planning, purchase of ingredients, and other preparatory tasks before the actual process of cooking. So, this glossary of local market produce was actually compiled by Mr. Holtham, who is the director for the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Yeah. And this Mr. Bert Whistle was the director of the local fisheries, I think, something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and actually, right, these three sections, right, they have become the enduring features of all the YWCA editions going forward. Yeah. Okay, so the recipes, as I said just now, they're organized into European, Chinese, and Indian and Malay sections, which kind of reflects the racial categorization in Malaya. So it's very organized, very rationalized, very systematic. and it placed the cookery of Malay on a very scientific footing. So if we were to compare the organization of information between the two recipes, right? I mean, the same recipe, potato soup. Mem's own, everything lumped together. And over here, the YWCA, you see the ingredients are taken out, separated. The same kind of sequence. But over here, right, you would peel the potatoes, cook them. So it's very easy to read and follow at one glance. So, so the ingredients are clearly listed separately, and each step is relayed in an active voice, and it's very plain and succinct. So, to top it off, unlike Mem's own, in Mem's own, right, you actually had to flip through the book to get to the recipe you want. But the thing for YWCA, it has an index at the back, an alphabetical index, to help you, quickly retrieve the information that you need. And these are the kind of things that we take for granted in cookbooks today. We kind of assume that this systematic way, it has always been like this, but no, actually, it kind of evolved from a very long, the conventions evolved over time. So, interestingly also, the preface for the YWCA book actually credited another book, Mrs. Lucas's French cookery book, for the arrangement of recipes and the description of cooking methods, which points to how actually cookbooks, right, like all other kind of texts, they borrowed and were influenced by each other. And a cookbook kind of represents the accumulated wisdom, creativity, and ingenuity of generations. So at the end of the day, right, a cookbook is meant to be used. It's a practical text. It's not for you to keep sui on a shelf and don't touch it, right? So so these pages actually come from our YWCA cookery book here, actually. So, is it? Yeah, I think so. So, actually, the second edition and the third edition, they all included blank pages for women to take notes. So, and to add on your own experiences and your own recipes, your own knowledge into the book. And, so these are evidence of their former life. So, okay, this is from the back of the 1935 copy. So these are all the extra names of ingredients. And if you note, right, the handwriting is actually different. So maybe there were two different readers. I don't know whether the book came to our collection before these people scribbled in or after. So they might have been scribbling in a library book. So I don't know. Okay, probably after. Okay, so anyway, and also in the same book you can find additional recipes. Oh, this is for kuih apam cantik manis. Yeah. So over time, right, you can see that cookbooks can become a kind of collage or a scrapbook of inspirations, including clippings of recipes from newspapers and people's own notes. So, okay, the YWCA cookery book was hugely popular, as you can see, and it was republished 9 times all the way until 1962, I believe. So these are the editions that are available in the library. So you see, you know what we are missing. So if any of you all have these at home, the gaps, you have, welcome to donate to us. So actually, I just want to highlight the third edition because this was only recently donated to us by Mrs. N. Wee. Yeah. So Mrs. N. Wee is actually regarded as the mother of social work in Singapore. So I mean, it really fills a gap because the 1939 edition, right, in the preface, it actually mentions that we decided to return to using the original cover because we liked it so much. So now we know that actually the first edition is this cover. Yeah. So I mean, I'm quite happy to know that. So, okay. Apart from what I mentioned about the new vegetarian, that little section that was added on in the third edition, there was also a section on bread making by Mrs. Newman, and there was also a Javanese section which disappeared, I think, in the next section. And then there was this one Japanese recipe for sukiyaki, which also disappeared after that. So, I mean, in keeping with the needs of the readership, right, I think this edition also included a chapter on baby feeding. Yeah. So people were very concerned about, proper nutrition for children as well as people who were sick. So the fifth edition is also worth noting because the editorship went to the hands of Mrs. Morag Llewellyn, and she will become the editor for all the remaining editions. So Mrs. Llewellyn was actually a qualified dietitian, and so there's a continued emphasis on nutrition. And then, but some of the ingredients for the recipes were changed because 1948, post-war, still dealing with difficulties. And then, okay, another major change in the 1948 edition was the translation of some of the methods and principles of cooking into Malay. And there were contributions of Malay recipes from Datuk Mahmud bin Mat, who was an officer in the Malayan Civil Service and then later the Menteri Besar of Pahang. So, to me, it's quite interesting. Is it because of like some kind of, like post-war, and they were returning to a different political situation, so they decided to have parts translated into Malay and more Malay contributions. I'm just speculating. So this one, right, this book was actually previously owned by a Dutch lady. So you also find evidence of its previous life inside the book. Yeah. So then in the 1962 edition, Mrs. Llewellyn also explicitly welcomed Chinese and Malay readers to give criticisms and suggestions for the respective Chinese and Malay sections, so that, I quote, "The genuine recipes of a race are first approved by their own people, which is the criterion of a reliable, authentic recipe." So again, maybe, being aware of the changed political situation then. So in any case, the reputation of the book, right, was basically cemented by the 1960s, because travelers to Singapore and to Malaya, right, would buy this book as a souvenir, and it was used in schools in Singapore and the Federation for Domestic Science courses. So the cookbook provided a platform through which women could express their opinions and contribute to improving nutrition, hygiene, and things that affected the health and welfare of Malaya, and which women, as caregivers and homemakers, could, make an active contribution. So at this point, right, I actually want to return to, the 1935 edition. So you might have noticed that, just now, right, actually the European section is very, very well developed, and the Malay section only had like 7 pages. So the editor actually says that it is with regret that so small a section should be presented in this book about the cookery of the native inhabitants of Malaya. And there are several reasons for this. The methods of cooking are handed down from one generation to another by word of mouth among the women for whom not much education had been achieved. And it is therefore only by watching and questioning that one may learn these things. Such research needs to be carried out by persons already well acquainted with the people, their customs, and language. So again, this raises, the important point that even, as we talk about women as a group, right, their experiences vary a lot, and again, when we look at English cookery books, we're looking at a group of women who are actually very privileged. So even among the local women who contributed recipes to the YWCA, they were probably more well-to-do and, considering that they were English educated. So continuing from this comment, so then the editor actually quotes Sir Frank Swettenham in his book British Malaya. So Sir Frank Swettenham says that a Malay man rarely mentions food. Being reserved and polite, he resents curiosity on the part of the stranger, particularly on the subject of women in his household. And then she says, at a meeting of anthropologists, the remark was recently made that it is often far more easy for a woman to get into touch with all the interesting details of the household. Then, you see, I think this is what she proposes for, the role that women can play in this research. She'll say that one day, some lady living in Malaya will give her time and patience to research in Malayan cookery, and if she has a flair for cooking herself, be able to write down the information in those measures and method descriptions that we know as recipes. So to me, I kind of see this as women kind of contributing to that ethnographic, project, that the colonial accumulation of knowledge and trying to map Malaya. So perhaps, like even recipes, they contributed to that idea of a total knowledge of Malaya right down to its most mundane and intimate aspects. So continuing along this line of thought about some lady living in Malaya, putting all these down on paper, it is interesting to me then how Asian women became the proponents of domestic science, and also they articulated ideas of feminine modernity through teaching cookery and writing cookbooks. So Asian women also taught cookery classes at the YWCA. So this is Mrs. Chen. And her cookery classes are attended by several European women keen to learn how to cook simple Chinese dishes, but no European woman has yet graduated to the advanced classes. So, so it's quite funny. So at first you see the European women teaching the local women, and now the local women are teaching the European women. So it's really an exchange. And then here, I can't really tell which one she is. So she is described as Mrs. Beaton in action. Anybody familiar with Mrs. Beaton? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so who is Mrs. Beeton, just to explain? So Isabella Beeton was a writer in Victorian England whose book of household management, which was first published in 1861. 1861, this is 1950 already. So she became one of the most famous, her book became one of the most famous cookery books ever published, and it is still in print today. So you can see Mrs. Beeton is some kind of legendary figure where the history of cookbook publishing is concerned. And for an Asian woman to be described in the English press as a Mrs. Beeton in action, I think that's quite something. So drawing this kind of parallel kind of suggests that Asian women who were trained or taught in domestic science and they were writing cookery books, they were recognized as being sort of on par, or fitting in with Western notions of feminine modernity. So here's another instance. An article, I just abstracted this from a much longer article about the progress of Malay women. So it mentioned Che Aziza. So Che Aziza, she was the youngest sister of Dato' On bin Jaafar, who was the founder of the UMNO and Menteri Besar of Johor. So Che Aziza was actually the principal of a domestic science school in Johor, and this school was actually started in 1947. Apart from teaching, she's also compiling a cookery book. What do they say? Okay, compiling a cookery book with international recipes. So again, they say, perhaps Che Aziza will be another Mrs. Beeton. Mrs. Beeton, if you remember, was not only a good cook, but a very progressively minded woman as well. So again, you see how cookbook writing and domestic science was an avenue by which women could attain recognition outside of the home. So even though we think that cookery was something that is something that further tied them back to domesticity and the home as feminine space, they were also regarded as being very modern and very progressive. For it meant they were running the home very efficiently on modern ideas of nutrition and hygiene. So no talk about local cookery book is complete without Mrs. Alice Handy. So, like I mentioned just now, she's a household name, and she was a Eurasian lady, and she's widely regarded as the author of the first Singaporean cookbook, which is my favorite recipes. First edition, we didn't have the first edition before, so luckily Mr. John Cole donated the first edition to us. If you have more copies of the first edition, we'll be willing to, we'll be very happy to accept as well, because this is our only copy. So again, okay, she was an educator and the first Asian principal of MGS, the Methodist Girls' School, and after the war, she was responsible for restarting MGS. So she compiled and published her recipes in an effort to raise funds for the school building. This is a newspaper advertisement talking about it. She has written a cookery book to swell her school's building fund. So again, we see the philanthropic efforts of women through the medium of cookbook writing. See. So first published in 1952, this cookery book offered easy-to-follow everyday recipes that reflected Singapore's multicultural heritage again. So there are recipes for curries, for your favorites like otak-otak, laksa, rojak, and it became an acclaimed classic among cookbooks published in Singapore and Malaysia. It's been republished more than 10 times over the last 50 years. And there's a more recent copy here on display. So you can compare the first edition and the more recent ones. So if you look at the preface, right, the objective here for her book is very different from what you see of the books that we saw before. So while the colonial cookbooks focus on giving housewives a kind of standard set of recipes that they could replicate very easily, Mrs. Handy here emphasizes on experimentation. It's for those who have a desire to learn to cook, must use your imagination, make changes to my recipes. No two people cook the same dish the same way, and both can produce equally good results. So you need to practice. So the format of the recipe here, you see, has become even more organized and even more systematic and easy to read. There's like numbering, it runs down like a list. And then ingredients, method, at least, there are like subtitles. Then at the end, right, she includes some ideas for you to vary the taste of the dish. So yeah, okay, so I'm coming to my last two books, so everybody please bear with me. So other cookbooks by Asian women, we're all very familiar with, a lot of people know Mrs. Elise Handy, but there are other cookbooks by Asian women that came after Mrs. Handy's book. So the next two books are specifically from a Chinese or Malayan Chinese perspective. So here we have Chinese Cookery Secrets. It's actually by Mrs. Esther Chen. I don't know whether this Mrs. Esther Chen is the same Esther Chen as the one that was teaching the YWCA cooking lessons. So the first edition we have here is by is published in 1952, and it came from the library of Malcolm MacDonald. So Malcolm MacDonald was actually the Governor General of the Malayan Union, 1946 to 48, yeah, and then, so it's quite special, I suppose, yes. So Mrs. Esther Chan, right, has actually had her recipes published in the Straits Times and all that. So again, so in this book, right, she explains or translates Chinese cooking principles and Chinese methods and recipes for an English audience. And it also includes line drawings, just drawings of, Chinese cooking utensils. So, but for me, right, the most interesting thing about this book, right, is not really the recipes. It's actually these illustrations. Because again, you don't really find illustrations of the interiors of homes and kitchens, you see. So in the first edition, you see there's the old type of Chinese kitchen, which you see, people are cooking over a wood fire. And it's very laborious because you need one lady apparently to tend to the fire while another lady does the cooking. And they all look kind of frumpy. Right? They're not cool, right? Then you can see the walls are kind of dark, so it's not very nice. And over here you see the modern type of Chinese kitchen. This very slim and fashionable lady who knows her hygiene because she's wearing an apron. Yeah? And then she's cooking on a charcoal stove. So wood stove become charcoal stove. So you can see, there's this idea of like progression, and like what modern Chinese lady should be like. And then, but the most surprising thing is, this book, there was a third edition in 1953, 1952, third edition. Same illustration, but with additional one, new and improved. Okay, so you see, here says modern type, right? Here become new type. And then over here you see the Western type of Chinese kitchen. So, again, even more fashionable Chinese lady with fashionable permed hairstyle, wearing a very impractical cheongsam at maybe it's a gas cooker or electric cooker. And then beside her there's a sink with, I don't really know what this is. Do you all know what this is? Hot water dispenser, okay. A boiler. Oh, so modern. Yeah. So, I'm really looking at these books, not really about the food, but, what they can tell us about the ideas that the writers had about women, you see. So this is very interesting to me. Okay, I'm at my last book already. So this is In a Malayan Kitchen, written by Mrs. Susie Hing. It's published in 1956. So you can see from the cover design, very modern, right? All these very youthful and very confident-looking Malayan ladies looking out right at you. I don't know why the depiction of the European lady is a bit different. She's kind of like angling her face away, but everybody is like full frontal. So, I don't know, is this some kind of comment to make? Yeah. So again, it's an ethnic representation of what Malaya was about. Yeah. So, and this is also, of course, the cover is just an expression of the content, right? So Mrs. Susie Hing, she kind of celebrates the cultural diversity of Malaya, and she says, one of the most attractive things about living here is its many and varied races, affording as it does many opportunities to absorb something from each and every one. This is just as true of cookery as it is of other interests. I have included Chinese, Malay, Javanese, and Indian recipes, as well as a few recipes of European cakes and desserts, hence my title, In a Malayan Kitchen. The dishes are as varied and colourful as our Malayan people. So you see, our. And then she bids everybody, Selamat makan. Yeah? Can't get more Malayan than that, right? So you see that cookery and food is a unifying element that can bridge the differences between communities. Maybe because you can see, published in 1956, which is a time of a lot of tension. Again, you see the same illustrations. I'm not sure how, because the publisher of this book is actually different from the publisher of the earlier book, but it again features these drawings of utensils. But the different thing is, in this book, right, these utensils are recast as Malayan utensils. Utensils you find in a Malayan kitchen, whereas earlier it was utensils you find in a Chinese kitchen. So, yeah. Okay, and then this sense of a Malayan unity and Malayan identity is also reflected in the organization of the recipes, where it is not organized by racial categories. It's not European section, Chinese section, Malay section, but it's actually all the recipes kind of like lumped together, maybe by type of dishes, such that you will find the recipe for nasi goreng next to fried rice, Cantonese style. So I mean, you can see, I don't know, I just imagine if I were a housewife, I'll be like, oh, maybe I can try this and cook it in a different way instead. So I cook in a Javanese way instead of my usual Chinese way. So in a way, I mean, cookbooks and cooking, right, kind of allowed communities, families to have a taste of what, in a very surface kind of way, a taste of what the everyday life of another family would be like, from a different community. This is what I imagine. So, okay, last slide already. Okay, very good. Okay, anyway, we started off by thinking about where women might have left their voices and ideas in print, and we have looked at different cookery books published over the span of 50 years, from the ones written by European women to those by local women on Malayan cookery. So, just to recap whatever I've been talking about so far, so cookbooks allowed individual women to share their knowledge and experiences with a wider community beyond their immediate family, and we see that cookbooks could be more than just a means for women to teach themselves how to cook, but also a tool that gave her authority in the kitchen, especially when you're dealing with your servant. So we also see how cookbooks are a product of collaborative effort between women and also men, and it also revealed the kind of community networks that they had. And cookbooks were also used as a means of fundraising. So in a very tangible way, they were used to support a cause, and then cookbooks also taught women the importance of nutrition, hygiene, and thus contributed to improving the welfare of Malaya. So we also see that cookery is a subject of practical and intellectual study. It is a science that is common and useful to women regardless of race or class. And the cookbooks also mapped the culinary heritage and dietary habits of different communities in Malaya and enabled cultural exchange by translating the methods and recipes from one community to another. Oh, okay. Finally, we have also seen how domestic science cookbook writing was something that tied women back to their home and their roles as caregivers and homemakers. Yet it was also very modern and progressive, and this idea of the scientific housewife running your house on a very efficient manner, it provided a model that both European and Asian women could aspire towards and attain some public recognition for. You could be in the papers, you see. So. I also want to re-emphasize that the scope of whatever I've discussed so far is limited to English language print cookbooks. And in our collection, right, we also have some Jawi recipe books, which I can't read Jawi, but you're welcome to come and read. And also, cookery and domestic writings aren't only found in cookery books. They can be found in newspaper columns. So for Straits Times, right, in the 1930s, there's actually a supplement that was for women. It was called In a Malayan Bungalow or Malayan Bungalow, something like that. So you can also look into these kind of things. And of course, there were also women's magazines. So there's still a lot to be explored. Yeah.
I'm just very curious. I'm trying to find out, but I just cannot find any information. Alice Handy. Handy is her married name, right? Mm. So her maiden name is Swiss in origin. But she's Eurasian. She's been stated to be Eurasian in two of the sources I found. Mm-hmm. But do you know what Eurasian heritage she is?
I think I came across the same information as you did, so I'm not really sure. But I don't know, perhaps because this is related to family history, right? So it would be best to then go back to the family, if possible, and find out. Yeah, that would be the most direct way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What about that Susie Hing? What is her background?
Okay, this is also very interesting because when I tried, for a lot of these women, right, I mean, usually when I look, I will go first to Newspaper SG. So if some of you are not familiar, Newspaper SG is actually we have a lot of digitized historical Singapore and Malayan newspapers. They are available on Newspaper SG. You just need to Google for it. So when I want to find out more about these women, right, the first thing I'll do is I'll go to the newspapers and I'll type in Susie Hing. But I cannot find anything about her. Yeah, I can only find, there are only 2 hits and they are advertisements, you see. So, and in her book, there's no further information given. Yeah. But one interesting thing is, some of her recipes, right, for the Javanese recipes, the I don't know what you call it, but the way they write the bahasa is for Jakarta is DGAKAR. Yeah, so I don't know whether maybe the choice of that particular form of translation, does it then indicate that maybe she actually came from Indonesia, probably, or she spent a lot of time in Indonesia because she has a lot of these Javanese sort of kind of recipes in her book. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah.
I have actually read Susie Heng's, and I think she has Indonesian origin. If you read the recipes,
Oh, okay.
they are very Indonesian.
They're Indonesian, yeah.
It's
Yes.
so interesting to go back to the history of our local cuisine, or the ma'am's cuisine.
Yes.
What are the chances of these books being replicated?
We have actually digitized the MEMS Cookery book and the third edition, the second edition of YWCA. So you can try and look for them on Book SG. Yeah. So, but in terms of you mean like reprinting these books again? I can't really say what would be the chances, because it really depends on is there a demand for such things? Yeah. I mean, but of course it'll be very interesting. But in any case, right, you can also come to level 11, and these books are also available on microfilm surrogates. So you can also try and like look at the recipes there, and if you wish, you can try and replicate lah. But I can't tell you how delicious it would be. Yeah.